Armenians know better than just about anyone else in the world how appallingly badly the international community has traditionally behaved in the face of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and other mass atrocity crimes. The Armenian Genocide of 100 years ago was, of course, only the beginning of a series of further catastrophes that erupted during the course of the 20th century, even though every time people said, we can never again let this happen again. The Holocaust, the Second World War, the Cambodian Genocide, notwithstanding the passage of the Genocide Convention and the other big international human rights and international humanitarian law treaties, the terrible catastrophes that unfolded during the 1990s in Rwanda in 1994, when 800,000 people were butchered in the space of just 3 short months. The Balkans, a series of catastrophes, in particular in Srebrenica, when 8,000 men and boys were taken out under the eyes of the international community and slaughtered. And of course, to this day, we have the continuing agony of Syria, of Yemen, of the Rohingya people in Myanmar, and maybe now a new set of agonies unfolding just across the border with Turkey's now intrusion into Kurdish Syria. In the face of all this, it did seem nearly 15 years ago that there was a big circuit breaker, a big possible breakthrough in the international community's response to all of this. Because what happened in 2005 on the occasion of the World Summit, 150 of the world's leaders, heads of state and government, unanimously agreed on a resolution in the UN General Assembly, unanimously agreed on a resolution around the theme of the responsibility to protect, with 3 very distinctive elements in it. The first responsibility was that of every sovereign state to ensure that these genocide and other atrocity crimes were not perpetrated within its own sovereign borders, either by the state itself or by others acting within that state. The second responsibility identified was that of the wider international community to assist a state that needed help in dealing with crises and catastrophes of this kind. And the third responsibility, which was the core of the breakthrough, was the unanimous acknowledgement in the United Nations that if atrocity crimes are occurring, if a state is manifestly failing in its responsibility to protect its own people from genocide and other atrocity crimes, then the wider international community had the responsibility to step in, including in extreme cases where this is the only option to deal with the situation, through the use of military force, provided that military force was authorised by the UN Security Council. This was a tremendous conceptual breakthrough in a world that was very used to saying what happened behind sovereign state borders was not anyone's business but that of the sovereign state itself. Here seemed to be an extraordinarily new commitment to a new moral norm that, notwithstanding all those traditional rules about non-interference, when these sort of things were unfolding within a sovereign state, it was not nobody's business, it was everybody's business. The background to that resolution in 2005 was essentially a series of catastrophes that unfolded during the 1990s in Rwanda, Central Africa, and the Balkans in particular. When it became obvious there was no consensus at all around the principle of humanitarian intervention. The global north used to love talking about humanitarian intervention, the right to intervene in these situations, but very rarely did anything. And the global south hated the whole idea that there was any kind of right for the big guys to throw their weight around militarily, even though they acknowledged sometimes there were terrible things occurring within those sovereign states. What happened is that Kofi Annan made a challenge to the international community in the Millennium Summit in 2000, and he said, look, if humanitarian intervention is such an unacceptable intrusion on state sovereignty, how then are we as an international community to react to these terrible human rights violations which offend every precept of our common humanity? The Canadian government responded to that challenge by appointing an international commission to address this whole issue of intervention and state sovereignty. I was asked to co-chair that with a very distinguished African diplomat. We produced our report a year later in 2001, and that called the responsibility to protect, and that formed the foundation of that major resolution in 2005. Okay, that was all 2005. What's happened since? How well have we done? How badly have we done? How much difference has it made getting this recognition of this principle of the responsibility to protect? Well, there's 4 parts to the story, which I'll summarise very briefly. I think 3 bits of the story are good news. The last bit is not good news at all. The 3 bits of good news are as follows. First of all, the passage of that resolution has had a big normative impact. It has created a new accepted international norm of behaviour, which people acknowledge, states acknowledge, in the context of, most obviously, of every year in the General Assembly. There's a big debate on this responsibility to protect principle, and although you still have half a dozen states saying, no, this is all a terrible idea and states should be completely free to do what they want, overwhelmingly, there is still repetition, acceptance of the force and the relevance and the utility and the moral force of those principles that I described. So normatively, it's still up there and out there, and people are paying lip service to it. And that's important, because if you want effective action, you do need to have minds at least acknowledging what the right thing is to do. Second thing that's happened is that institutionally, the Responsibility to Protect resolution has been the catalyst for quite a few important innovations. More than 60 countries and international organisations now have full-time officials devoted to analysing potential genocide and other mass atrocity situations, and then energising a national government response to those situations if they arise. That was unheard of before. You just didn't have that focal point attention. We have had, of course, the establishment of the International Criminal Court, offering a source of judicial remedy for some of the worst behaviour of this kind. We've had militaries around the world adjusting their training and their doctrine and rules of engagement to deal with the kind of fire brigade situations that responding to these cases sometimes and often demands if you are going to have military action. And you've had generally an increase in civilian awareness and preparedness. So institutionally, that's a tick. That's good news. It has made a difference. The third benchmark against which to test its effectiveness has, I think, is obviously how effective has this been in preventing genocidal catastrophes occurring. Here, of course, it's always difficult to make a judgment, a causal judgment, because when prevention succeeds, by definition, nothing happens. And very often, as a result, nobody notices. But I think you can make a quite strong argument, looking at a number of West African cases and elsewhere around the world, for the existence of the responsibility to protect being quite important. Let me just give you one example, Burundi in Central Africa, which has very similar demography to Rwanda next door, a long tradition of ethnic tension. It's been on the edge of a genocidal volcano for decades, literally decades, and there have been major eruptions in the past. And it's looked quite likely a number of times in the last 15 years that the volcano would erupt again, but every time that seemed imminent, the Security Council has met, the principle of responsibility to protect has been invoked, the UN has got engaged diplomatically, sending missions, or the African Union has got engaged, and there's just generally been a real focus on it, which has pulled people back from the brink every time. So preventively, I think it's quite a good story. The final benchmark, however, is not such a good story, and that's the crucial one of effective reaction. What do you actually do if genocide is occurring? If there's been an outbreak of this extreme violence, ethnic cleansing, other crimes against humanity, what do you do? How effectively has the response been when prevention has obviously failed and you've got a real-life catastrophe unfolding in front of you? Well, there's been some success stories. Kenya in 2008, where there was a big diplomatic intervention after it seemed like the country was going to explode in ethnic crisis. That was a success story. There have been others in West Africa. But there was a success story in the first weeks of the Libya affair, when it was obvious that Gaddafi was completely out of control, that he was sending troops across northern Libya to engage in what everyone anticipated would be a massacre in the city of Benghazi, in which 10, 20, 30,000 people probably would have been killed. And in response to that, invoking the responsibility to protect principle, the Security Council acted first of all to give Gaddafi a whole series of messages and threaten him with criminal prosecution and sanctions and arms embargoes and all the rest of it. And then 2 weeks later, when it became obvious he was not going to respond to that, the Security Council actually agreed on a military enforcement mandate and a military enforcement mission. And in particular, the NATO forces got immediately engaged, and that massacre in Benghazi was averted. However, that was the last really effective intervention we've had, visibly by the international community. The Syrian affair erupted very shortly thereafter in the same year, 2011. Consensus completely broke down in the Security Council about how to react to that, largely as a result of what had happened in the latter part of the Libyan affair, when it was seen that the Western forces were engaged in regime change, not just in civilian protection. We've had a breakdown of consensus in the Security Council. We've had other problems arise, obviously, in Sri Lanka before that, and more recently in the situation with Yemen, the situation with the Myanmar in Rohingya, which you've heard about, and of course the ongoing catastrophe in Syria itself. So what do we say about all this? Does this mean that responsibility to protect has been a complete waste of time and energy and emotional commitment? I don't think so. I think when you add up the normative new principles that are out there and accepted, when you take into account the institutional changes, when you take into account the preventive things that have occurred, I think this still has a lot of momentum, and it's still critically important that we have confidence in the applicability of this principle for the future. A lot of it is going to depend on top-down behaviour by the governments that matter most. And it's not just the Chinese and the Russians who behave pretty badly when it comes to exercising the vetoes. It's also, of course, the Americans who behaved shockingly badly with their decision just in the last 2 weeks, was initiated the new crisis in Syria. It has been France and the United Kingdom who behaved very insensitively in the latter stages of the Libya affair and generated that environment of lack of trust and confidence in the Security Council, which has meant the impotence of the Council in recent years. It's also so there's a top-down responsibility to refocus on this and try and re-establish a basis for consensus in the Security Council. There's a peer group pressure responsibility from every other country in the world to try to hold the big guys to account, including in a United Nations context, and say, listen, you have a responsibility to act in these situations. You can't pretend it's nobody's business. These shocking crimes against humanity are everyone's business. So all our governments should be engaged in every possible environment to do just that, and that depends, thirdly, for them to do that effectively, on bottom-up pressure from civil society, from NGOs around the world, taking this whole enterprise seriously and putting their own governments under constant pressure to be sensitive and effective and responsive in relation to this. So I'm a bit of a congenital optimist about all these things. When I look back over the course of human history, there's an awful lot that's gone wrong, but there's an awful lot that's got progressively better over time. And I think we have to just keep our optimism, keep our energy levels up, and work very, very hard to consolidate the progress that we do from time to time make. So I'm happy to take questions in the remaining 5 minutes that we have, and I'm sorry that it's so limited.
Thank you very much, sir. I'm Mohammed Hassan from Maiduguri, Nigeria.
Yeah.
I want to refer to the Libyan issue. Some months after the Security Council resolution to enforce an air blockade over Libya, the issue of regime change came. And in West Africa, we were concerned that when was the second resolution to enforce the regime change, when did it take place? And so anytime the Security Council takes a decision to intervene in these similar cases, we become concerned.
What went wrong in Libya was very simply this. The mandate that the Security Council gave, with the complete acceptance of the Global South and China and Russia, the mandate was a civilian protection mandate. was to protect civilians immediately in the context of Benghazi, but also more generally. Of course, there was always an argument that you weren't necessarily going to be able to protect civilians from the air when Gaddafi, if he was still arresting people, going house to house in Tripoli and imprisoning and executing people. If there had been a serious attempt at diplomacy after the initial success in stopping the Benghazi massacre, if there'd been a serious effort of diplomacy, as Nigeria wanted, as South Africa wanted, as the Arab League wanted, and there had been an effort to persuade Gaddafi to then step back and perhaps step out of office or, somehow guarantee that there would be no continuation of the massacre, I think the Security Council would have come along. If you've been through that process and it had become apparent that there was no diplomatic solution, that Gaddafi was a complete grotesque and was incapable of changing his ways, I think it would have been possible through effective diplomacy on the Security Council to bring the rest of the countries with them. To say, okay, we've tried diplomacy, we've shown that we'll use force if we have to, but it's obvious that the only way we're going to solve this is through regime change, forcible regime change. But that's not the way it worked. The way it worked is the United States, Britain, France just pocketed the mandate, ran with it and said, don't trouble us with all this stuff. We're not even going to listen to you. Gaddafi is a monster. We're just going to go and kill him. And that, as a result, is what led to that breakdown of consensus. Because then when Assad started behaving in exactly the same way in Syria, about exactly the same time, when it was obvious that the Security Council, forget about military action, but if it was obvious that the Security Council should have condemned him, should have arms embargo, should have been a threat of criminal prosecution, should have been sanctions, the Security Council did absolutely nothing because they've said, we see what happens when we start this process, we give you guys an inch, you take a mile. So I don't normally like being critical of countries who by and large do behave responsibly, but they behave very irresponsibly on that occasion, and that's the reason why we've had such a breakdown in consensus. I think there's a way through all this. It was advocated by Brazil actually in 2011, not under the current Brazilian president, who I don't think is very sensitive on this stuff, but the idea was that whenever any such mandate is granted in the future, that there's a process of ongoing review and reference back to the Security Council so that you can keep the consensus, you can keep the confidence of the Security Council that you are not misusing that mandate. So I think there's a basis there. The times are not ripe at the moment, but over the next 2, 3, 4 years, I think we can perhaps recover some ground. I think he's going to have to wait till Mr. Trump goes and a few other changes perhaps in Russia, but I'm reasonably confident that over time we can get there. So.
I have a sort of question about global governance, really, and where you feel that's going. And organisations like the ICC, with sort of two landmark cases of like Kenyatta in Kenya, who is gone on to become president and therefore seems to have avoided accountability, and Jean-Pierre Bemba in also with and being convicted, and then afterwards his defence was that he didn't know. Does the ICC, and it's a wider question than that really, do we still value bilateralism and global governance, and is that undermining human rights?
Yeah, well look, global governance, multilateralism generally is under stress, under pressure, in strife at the moment, and obviously Trump's performance again on that subject does not help to create an environment of new confidence in those institutions. And America itself walking away completely from the ICC after having given it tacit support for so long. The ICC has had its problems. I think it's had unreasonable problems for a lot of the African states who've said it's biased somehow against Africa because all the cases have been there. I don't think that's really been fair. That said, it hasn't handled some of those prosecutions with a great deal of sensitivity, and maybe some of the appeal cases have gone in a way that hasn't helped its credibility for the longer term, and maybe you've identified one or two of them. But we must not lose faith and hope and confidence about the ICC. It's a critical new element in the global governance institutional apparatus. It's absolutely critical that it win and retain the confidence of the world, because without that standard setting and application, you simply won't have any kind of possibility of getting rid of the impunity that's been such a problem, impunity in the past, and you won't have the kind of deterrence that you need for the future. So if there's any cause that's really worth getting behind, it's certainly the ICC.
Sorry, I'm a teacher, and it's just interesting because I'd 100% agree with what you're saying, having been through Rwanda and the Balkans and so on. When I teach students, they are very cynical about the UN Security Council and the ICC, and even institutions in Great Britain like the NHS, and I have to almost explain to them, because that generation haven't been through it, how these are actually amazing organisations, and we need to appreciate what they are, but they just tend to see the bad things. You sort of worry for the future.
Well, someone recently commented in the context of Europe and what's going on there, not just Brexit, but a lot of the other lack of confidence in European governments. These are the feckless children of 70 years of peace, not recognising just how significant the institutional reality of having something like the EU, having these institutions actually is. Each generation seems to have to relearn about the role of the United Nations and the role of serious intergovernmental organisation. But my last message to you all is don't lose your optimism. Unless you believe in the possibility of change, you're never going to get energetic about trying to argue for change. So as difficult and as impossible as it seems from time to time, the wheels of history do turn. Presidents and prime ministers do change. Over terrible behaviour generates eventually a backlash in terms of the way in which the citizenry responds to autocracy. And complete overreach in terms of contemptuous distaste and denial of the utility of these international institutions will breed its own reaction over time as people see the utility of them and the absolute necessity. So don't lose your optimism, in particular the younger generation, on whom we're going to need to really carry these fights forward. I'm far too old. My generations, we're a bit of a bust, I'm afraid. It's you guys that have really got to carry the can. So over to you.